Hey everyone, how's it going? Juan Dhas here, and welcome back to another lesson video. It's been a little while. I know I keep saying that these days, but I do want to be more regular with it, and I've just had to, cover the new guitar, get used to the new guitar. There was also the new book. Speaking of, a huge thank you to everyone that's purchased a copy of the book. I've had some lovely comments back on it, and it's just my little drop in the ocean, so to speak, of helping people with composition and finding their way of writing, their method of writing, through using my own as a quote-unquote blueprint. Also, a huge thank you to everyone who's been checking out the new music and the new record. I think we're nearly at 5,000 streams-ish on Spotify last I checked. So please do keep supporting. It genuinely means the absolute world. Now to dive right into the lesson material, if you haven't guessed by the title, we're diving into fingerstyle guitar playing. And specifically, I wanted to do this because I've been receiving a few questions about it over the past few months, especially as someone who was known for playing with a pick. I was more of a hybrid picker, and that was pretty much my main technique, or something I worked with a bunch of people on, and that was something I developed and then decided to switch to fingerstyle. So we're going to cover why I switched to fingerstyle, some exercises or things for you to consider when trying fingerstyle, and some things you can do to hopefully facilitate that little transition, if that's a transition you would like to make, or at least a sound you would like to explore. So to dive right in, why did I decide to switch to fingerstyle, especially after having played for so many years with a pick, and I was even using special picks. Why did I decide to do it? I was working with a mentor figure of mine, Daniele Camarda, who I'm sure is a familiar name for some of you that watch the videos, because he really changed how I look at things, and how I look at things musically and technically and compositionally even. But we were doing a dynamic exercise, I remember, just kind of like a dynamic pyramid exercise. And I realized, or rather he realized and told me, hey, you did that really well. I think you should consider, or really consider, playing with fingers. You'll find much easier dynamic range, which is one of the benefits of playing fingerstyle. And two, it's a more personal sound. And the latter definitely rang true for me. Those words kind of stayed in my mind, in the back of my mind, for a little while. And the more I've played around with fingerstyle, the more I think that is quite an interesting observation. Tonally speaking, you get a lot of tonal variety or timbral variety out of a single note. And that's one of the main reasons I switched, because I found it really interesting. I could suddenly play up on the neck, but play the same thing at the bridge, and do so comfortably without kind of worrying about muting or anything like that. Also, if I play in the middle, but then I can adjust that for individual notes as I see fit. And do those changes pretty much at will. Especially this comes in handy, especially when you're playing with a band, because this is one of the main pitfalls or downfalls of fingerstyle playing, is that it is easier to get lost in a band mix. So to help with overall projection, when I'm playing live with a band or with a drummer, I'm usually picking closer to the bridge to help projection. Now, another reason I shifted over was rhythmic consistency. I found personally that my rhythm, or my time in general, was a lot more consistent. This is a personal thing. This might not ring true for everybody, but my time was more consistent. I was able to swing a little harder, which is an interesting observation too. And I attribute that to a lot of things being very immediate. And immediacy is something, as I've mentioned in a couple of videos, that I'm valuing these days, to the point where My current rig is just my reverb pedal going into my effects loop and then just one cable straight into the front of the amp. But that allows me to get it allows me to be very precise with rhythm, and at least in my mind, I'm not anticipating the note. And I know this is a really esoteric way of thinking about it, but there's something to be said about your finger just meeting the string and plucking and having a note come out of it. It's almost like a little, so it could entirely be placebo. I could just be perceiving things in a very odd way, but there is something to be said for the immediacy of just having a note pop out of the instrument like that. And another reason I switched over to fingerstyle was just it felt very comfortable. Also, because I'm playing slide a lot, it's just a practical reason. When I find the best tone when playing slide comes from when you use your fingers on your right hand. Now, switching between a pick, which I tried for a while, I used to have like a little pocket on my carvin, which I've since removed from the carvin, where I'd keep the pick and then I'd transition. But that grew to be a little cumbersome when you play live, and I'm all about quick decisions on the spot. So I want things to be as simple as possible so that I don't have to think about these things. So I think what actually kickstarted the transition was actually playing with slide a little more seriously, getting frustrated with having to change back and forth. And also getting greater dynamic variation, timbral variation, rhythm chops, and a few other things, like just practical reasons. So those are the reasons I switched to playing fingerstyle, and you might find them to be true, but there are a couple of things that when you're switching over, you have to be considerate of. Now, I should note that, and I say this for any of the classical guitar players watching, I'm by no means a classical guitar player. I've never studied classical guitar formally, so a lot of my technique is actually partially through observing some classical guitar players, but then also adapting things to make sense, especially because I play an extended range instrument, I play an electric instrument. There are different considerations that come into play. From string spacing, I noticed that if even playing a Strat style guitar, fingerstyle is a little easier because there's a wider string spacing, which means you don't have to be so worried about fine movements. One thing I've noticed with headless instruments, or when I started on the carvin, is that I would have to be very careful about my travel with my fingers. And if there was too much travel, then I risk hitting the next string. So you had to get very precise. It's a little easier on a classical instrument, for instance. Also, because a classical instrument is an acoustic instrument, you kind of want to hear those overtones, so you're not as concerned about muting, whereas on an electric instrument, an open string ringing out is pretty obvious. So I've had to adapt muting and take things into consideration, and some of this came from slide playing. So I want to get into just some minor things about mechanics, some exercises you can do, and hopefully this will get you up and running for at least experimenting with it. I would also like to note, if you're seriously considering this, give yourself a month. This was actually a little challenge I did myself where I took it to an extreme. If I showed up to a recording session, if I showed up to rehearsals or gigs, I would try to play fingerstyle. I'd take a pick with me just in case, to be professional, in case my fingers failed. And that happened one time after the month. I decided to push it a little longer, but I played an open air gig. My fingers weren't used to it. Everything was feeling strange, so I just had to switch to a pick for that gig. Now I'm much more comfortable. So it's not as big of a concern, especially now that I've been doing this much longer, almost a year at this point. But I will say, give yourself a month, force yourself to do it, take a pick just in case. You don't have to go as extreme as I did. of just completely doing fingerstyle. You might even find some videos from back then. I even did some guest solos for somebody where I played fingerstyle, but that was part of the challenge. So give yourself a time frame, a month, 2 months, 3 months, see how you feel, explore it in depth, as opposed to, try it for a few days and then, go back to playing with a pick. You really want to train your fingers to see how this is going to work. So as far as mechanics are concerned, one thing I suggest this to students, or I used to talk about this when I talked about hybrid picking with students. First thing, be mindful of picking from further back in the arm, or at least visualizing that the movement is coming from further back in your arm. This will actually give you a much wider range of motion, your muscles will be more relaxed, and you're not loading smaller muscles with more work than they need to. You're using your body to its best effect. As far as muting is concerned, this is something I picked up from slide. I sometimes use my thumb, especially on an extended range instrument where that low B can just ring if you leave it. If I adopted a more classical style position, like there, the low B's slightly ringing out. So this is an adaptation I've had to make for electric instruments. My thumb ever so slightly rests here. And this is something I picked up from slide where I'm muting below the string I'm attacking. And I'm also, with the slide, I'm muting with the left hand above the string, or sometimes even both hands, and then just using one. But when I'm playing normally, that's usually assigned to the left hand. So it's left hand and right hand muting. The other thing, if you're coming from a pick, one thing I would suggest, if you maybe want to slowly transition to this, try figure out hybrid picking, but using all 3 of your other fingers as independent fingers, as opposed to just assigning one finger to hybrid picking and working exclusively with pick and this. So we'll touch on that in exercises you can do. But it's something to consider. But regardless of whether you're a hybrid picker or whether you're a normal alternate guy or whatever your picking style of choice is, you will have to train your index finger. And the reason for that is one thing I came to realize, especially as I was playing more linear ideas, was that when I played things in the lower register and I assigned that to my thumb, because of the angle of attack, I'm picking with the side of my thumb, and that doesn't yield the clearest tone. It gives you a very warm tone, but it's not very clear. And you see there I'm switching to my index and middle finger to account for lower strings. So depending on the context I'm playing with, if I want clarity, I will switch to one of these 2 fingers for lower range notes. Some certain movements, especially for arpeggios. Sorry, let me get a little more volume on that for you guys. Right. I do more of like a, I forget the term for it. It's not free stroke, is it? Could be. Yes, free stroke as opposed to rest stroke. But I like the definition I get from having one finger per note. And sometimes I'll do that. And because I'm more of a left-hand dominant player anyway, this kind of works out. But the point I'm trying to make is for certain arpeggios, you want this index finger to actually be working so that you can get certain transitions down. If you're doing it with your thumb, almost like you were playing with a pick, but without a pick, it can be a little clumsy sometimes, and tonally speaking, you're not going to be able to cut. So if you're playing with a band, that can be quite problematic. And when you need to cut, you need that index finger to be working for you. So mechanically, things to consider. Muting, consider using your thumb, or not just the flesh of your palm, but also your thumb and your left hand working together to mute as and where needed on an electric instrument. Bear in mind, I really have to hammer this point home. This is not traditional fingerstyle technique. Be mindful that you're picking from further back in the arm so you get a wider range of motion and you're fatiguing your muscles less. You know, you're not picking from like here or not imagining that the motion starts there. The other thing I would recommend is try, if and where possible, to kind of use the tip of your finger as opposed to a lot of the flesh. You'll get a more pointed and direct sound. Obviously, being aware of both is nice. I use a small combination of nail and tip because it just kind of rounds it out a little more. That said, bear in mind, I don't have nails. They're very short, and I maybe grew them like a couple of tiny millimeters, or millimeters on millimeters even, just so I get a little more definition. But I don't have nails. I'm not particularly fussy about them. I'm more concerned about just playing the instrument. And I want to hammer that point home in case some people are worried about, oh, do I have to worry about nail maintenance and shaping and hardening? You don't have to if you don't want to. Although I will say with nails, you will get more clarity. And that's where you find guys like Matteo Mancuso really excelling. Simply because the nails facilitate a clearer attack and it sounds closer to the attack you would get with a pick as opposed to just flesh. With flesh or a combination thereof, you're going to get a rounder sound. So exercises, first, if you're completely not used to this, just try regular classical style Pima exercises. Like, you don't even have to go look them up, just maybe try different combinations of fingers. So for instance, index and middle, or you can try index and ring, middle and ring, for instance, thumb and one of the other variations, thumb and middle. That's actually a combination I use quite a lot, especially when you're thinking of string skipped ideas like... You know, you've got to be really aware of these. So you can try that applied to scales. Arpeggios are a really great thing to do. They'll help get your string crossings in order. Figure out, now I will say there's no exact science, and that's probably one of the flaws about how I'm looking at this. It's very intuitive. But find the combination of right hand fingerings. It's kind of like Nelson Veras in the way there's not really an exact science. Because in my mind, if I'm worrying about which finger to play with all the time outside of general tonal considerations, I might not, I'm not focusing on the improv, I'm focusing on something else entirely. The other thing you can do is just completely switch over and play things that are familiar to you, but with your fingers, and really dive in as far as, dive into, how can I put this? Dive into just what I said earlier of trying to find an isolated period of time and play for that whole duration. Play for that whole duration of time, if you would, with just your fingers. But take heads, like... Oop. Play a head like Donna Lee, or what was another one? Anthropology, or play complicated heads. That'll get you up and running pretty smoothly. Also do try, this is the last piece of advice for jumping into this before we close out the video. Take your time. You don't have to be guns blazing and playing and running all up and down the fretboard. Just try. Really hone into the sound you're creating and just get comfortable with using your fingers. How different regions of playing you know, from bridge to neck, how they respond. The tension will feel different, everything will feel different. So just focus on that. And I think that's a fairly no frills way of getting into fingerstyle, without adopting or without having to go through maybe rigorous classical training. It's open for everyone. You can try it. Remember, on an electric instrument, there aren't really any conventions, just suggestions, if you would. So you will have to make some adaptations, especially depending on your instrument and how it sits on your body. You know, make those at will and what's comfortable for you. But I hope this video has helped some people out there in trying to make this a little more accessible, trying to maybe, if you've been curious about playing fingerstyle but didn't know where to begin, hopefully this has given you some ideas of how to go forward. So if you have any lesson topics, please leave them in the comments section. I'm always reading the comments section. So do let me know, and I'll see you very soon for another video. Until then, take care, guys.